People think Hitler's hatred for Jews was absolute and without exception. They think the SS was a perfectly pure Aryan organization. But he didn't apply his hatred for Jews evenly, and that contradiction is far more disturbing than most people realize. Hidden in the archives of the Third Reich is a terrifying reality. There were Jews that Hitler deemed valuable or that he owed personal debts to. His ideology was secondary to even his personal whims. Even at the height of the Holocaust, a single signature from Hitler could transform a condemned person into what officials chillingly labeled a noble Jew. It was a belief that threatened to tear the inner workings of the Reich apart. This is the story of the Jews that Hitler secretly protected. It started with a pain in the chest. Clara Hitler felt ashamed to complain, telling her doctor in hushed tones that the pain had kept her awake at night for weeks. She'd always been hardworking, but it had become too much. The test showed an extensive tumor of the breast. Clara's 18-year-old son Adolf rushed back from Vienna, where against his dead father's wishes, he'd been trying to become an artist. He slept in the spare room of Clara's modest apartment in Urfahr, a suburb of Linz, Austria, listening to his mother's agonizing groans in the night. She was dying, and he couldn't accept it. Adolf had always tried to protect her from Aloy, his short-tempered, authoritarian tyrant of a father. Prior to Aloy's premature death, Adolf had stuck up for Clara when Aloy, always drunk from the inns, had raised his fist to her. And now this woman he so deeply loved and admired, the woman who had spoiled him after losing 3 children to disease, was fading away before his eyes. He was helpless. Adolf waited on her hand and foot, hoping for a miracle that, if it happened, would surely come from the family's dedicated and trusted physician, Dr. Eduard Bloch. Bloch witnessed for himself how much this young man adored his mother, standing at her bedside, bringing her water, pushing food into her dry mouth. Adolf truly believed Clara could beat the disease. His hopes were resting on Bloch and the wonders of modern German medicine. But it wasn't to be. As Clara lay silent in the bed one afternoon, Bloch took Adolf aside. The operation had failed, the cancer had spread. Bloch later noted his long, sallow face was contorted, tears flowed from his eyes. This woman, who had endured so much tragedy, so many beatings, such a loving and supportive woman, was too young to die. She was only 47. Adolf pleaded with Bloch to save her. Bloch rested his hands on Adolf's shoulder. He would try. His family had been good to him. Clara, the kids, were hard-working, honest people. There was a special treatment available, no guarantees, but without it, Clara wouldn't last long. It was worth a shot. Adolf waited nervously as Bloch went to his office and picked up a bottle of iodoform, a disinfectant used for its healing and antiseptic properties. It was believed that it could dissolve deadly tumors. Adolf watched as Bloch lathered some gauze with the chemical and packed it into the open wound still open from Clara's operation. She screamed out in pain as the chemical burned in her breast. In his heart, Bloch knew it wouldn't work. He was doing it for Adolf. He couldn't stand to see him so devastated. Bloch would later write, "She bore her burden well, unflinching and uncomplaining, but it seemed to torture her son. An anguished grimace would come over him when he saw pain contract her face." But Adolf was filled with gratitude. He looked on as Bloch eased his mother's pain with another injection of morphine. She slowly wasted away, more concerned with what would happen to her children than dying. Rather than help, the caustic iodoform was not only excruciatingly painful, but it was completely ineffective. It was horrific for Adolf to witness what cancer did to his mom. In the years to come, when he grew into a savage political leader, he shouted into a microphone about the Jewish cancer. Was his dying mother's agony at the back of his mind? But Hitler didn't blame Dr. Bloch, that much is certain. After Clara passed away and Adolf fell into a deep depression, he would express his undying gratitude for what Dr. Bloch had done for his mother in her hour of need. Dr. Bloch, who was a Jew, a man who the Hitler family greatly respected, a man who was known to treat poor families like the Hitlers at any hour of the night, often not even charging them if money was hard to come by. Bloch was a hero to a boy who would go on to take the lives of 6 million people like him, Jews. An undying bond had been created, a contradiction of vast proportions that one day Bloch would have to contend with. It set up a collision between an old loyalty and a genocidal ideology. By the early 1920s, Hitler was already very politically active. He had failed as an artist. He'd been injured twice in World War I and lived in abject poverty. But he had burst from humiliating obscurity to become a mouthpiece for the short-lived German Workers' Party. Alongside him every step of the way was his friend and associate, Emil Maurice. Maurice was so devoted to this man, he copied his clothes and wore a toothbrush mustache. Confidant, enforcer, loyal to the end. He would have done anything for Hitler. But Maurice was hiding a dangerous secret. He was a Jew. By blood, at least. That was undeniable. And yet, he had still become the supreme leader of the SA stormtroopers, chosen by Hitler to be his chauffeur and personal bodyguard. At the time, Hitler was leading the Nazi Party, transforming it into a burgeoning nationalist movement built around his intense speeches of promises of national rebirth. Maurice was still at Hitler's side in 1923 when Hitler launched a coup attempt to remove the corrupt, elite-infested German government of the Weimar Republic. He was still there in prison after the coup had failed and Hitler had been convicted of high treason. Hitler dictated the start of his book Mein Kampf to him, later helping out when Rudolf Hess took over the writing as Hitler expressed his views on the Jew. Hitler's power grew and Maurice was there for every triumph. He stood beside Hitler as his radical speeches, once dismissed as the rantings of a fringe activist, started to resonate with the German public. Millions of ordinary people were left hungry, unemployed and hopeless after the Wall Street crash of 1929 shattered the economy. Meanwhile, the elites remained insulated from the suffering around them. Hitler promised a new beginning, a healthy Germany, strong again after the humiliation of World War I reparations. He swore the country would be free of the greedy, corrupt Jewish bankers who he claimed had destroyed the economy. The timing was perfect for the rise of a tyrant. By 1934, he had consolidated absolute power. He was now Germany's dictator, the Führer. And still at his side stood the same man who'd supported him from the very beginning. Few people in the world knew Hitler well, but Emil Maurice was one of them. Hitler trusted him with his life. But he was tainted. Emil knew that well. He'd helped Hitler write the book that stated it clearly. According to later SS investigations, his great-grandfather, Charles Maurice Schwarzenberger, had been a Jewish actor in Hamburg. It wasn't the kind of family history that could remain buried in a regime that went to great lengths to examine people's bloodlines. It made Maurice 1/8 Jewish. And this was problematic. For the Nazis, Jews were the bane of mankind, and they made sure the public understood. People saw it in the movies, posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts. When Joseph Goebbels' propaganda campaigns portrayed all Jews as toxic, selfish, and cruel, they were always the villains, the thieves, the traitors, the abusers, parasitical and predatory. And Maurice was one of them. In terms of optics, if the German public found out, then it would look like a gaping contradiction. Maurice had already received the Blood Order, one of the Nazis' highest decorations. He and Hitler were almost fused at the flesh, blood brothers, yet his blood was supposedly contaminated. For some of Hitler's inner circle, that meant Maurice was contaminating Hitler and possibly the Third Reich. Hitler had preached to millions of people about the superiority of the so-called Aryan race and what he deemed as the abject inferiority of Jews. By this, he meant something innate and hereditary, not environmental or cultural, but purely a matter of genetics. He had been influenced by the pseudo-scientific racial theories and eugenics movements in parts of the USA and Britain during the early 20th century. It would turn out to be a deadly idea. All great cultures, he said, perished from blood poisoning. The Americans, whose eugenics programs he openly admired, had in his eyes weakened themselves through racial mixing and became a nation of mongrels. Yet, there he was, spreading those beliefs with a man at his side whose ancestry, by the Nazis' very own doctrine, was the worst kind, part Jew. History doesn't make it clear if Maurice completely hid this from Hitler or if he merely downplayed it. But for one of Hitler's top men, one of the most powerful men in all of Nazi Germany, it mattered. It mattered a lot. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS from 1929, would become one of the main architects of the Holocaust and enforcer of the Nazis' racial policies. He couldn't sit by and watch as Hitler spent much of his life next to a man whose not-too-distant ancestors had sullied the German Aryan race. Without question, Himmler made clear, Maurice is, according to his ancestral table, not of Aryan descent. He wasn't deemed an enemy of the state, but a blood-determined character. That meant Maurice could not be completely trusted. Himmler called him a security risk. Few other men in Germany knew the secrets of the Führer, and one of them was part Jewish. Himmler wanted Maurice gone, not harmed, but stripped of his position and influence. But Hitler couldn't discard a man that he knew for a fact would never go against him. Still, as Himmler reminded Hitler, the Nuremberg laws clearly stated if you couldn't prove Aryan ancestry back to the 1700s, you couldn't be SS. It was clear Maurice did not pass that test. For the populace, ancestry went back to 1800, but for SS men, 1750, long before Maurice's great-grandfather had trodden boards in his theater. Himmler was right, there was no getting around it. But was he also envious of a man Hitler put so much faith in? Maurice had co-founded the SS. He was listed as member number 2, only behind Hitler himself. Himmler wasn't even close at member number 168. Did he really have the right to demand Maurice be thrown to the side? It was a conundrum that refused to die, but in 1935 Hitler found a solution. In August of that year, he wrote a top-secret letter to Himmler. His loyal friend Maurice wasn't leaving the SS. Instead, he was becoming an Honorary Aryan. He might be part Jewish, a Mischling, but soon he'd be the owner of a special certificate that would hide the Jew in his genetic makeup. A simple workaround, but one that exposed the sheer insanity of believing that bloodline defines a person's character. Loyalty, it seemed, trumped racial purity at the highest levels of the Nazi Party. Hitler's willingness to bend his own rules for his inner circle set a dangerous precedent, one that would expose the vast contradictions in the very foundations of Nazi ideology. Nazi Germany was already in the grips of a delirious anti-Semitism. Children learned about the greedy Jew with the hooked nose and the weak posture at the side of the fit, strong, and honest Aryan. They were actively applauded for scrawling Jude on the fronts of Jewish shops and houses. Hitler was busy scrawling too. His signature would actively save Jewish people from the grave turmoil most Jews faced in Germany. The Nuremberg laws stripped millions of their rights, but behind closed doors, the hypocrisy was codified. Hitler personally signed an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 German blood certificates to exempt specific individuals from racial laws. This was the same man who called the Mischlinge monstrosities halfway between man and ape, people whose very blood he claimed made them sinful. Yet, like Emil Maurice, not all of them were headed for the meat grinder of forced labor or the gas chamber. Instead, they were quietly removed. In 1941, Heinz Gerlach wrote to Bernhard Rust, the Nazi Minister of Education, "I cannot help it that I am a Mischling. Also, no one should blame my parents for my situation. They married during a time without racial laws." Germany was home to tens of thousands of people who were part Jewish but had become Christian. Once Hitler was in power, they had professed their love for their fatherland and the Führer. How is it fair that such people should be punished? Colonel Ernst Bloch was the son of a Jewish man. He had his face torn apart by a bayonet in World War I and earned the Iron Cross. He went on to fight most of the next war openly Jewish, but it wasn't until 1944 that there was a problem when Himmler demanded his dismissal. On February 15, 1945, he received a signed letter from Hitler about losing his job because of his heritage. His superior wrote, "It is an honor to thank you on behalf of the Führer for your service rendered during war and peace for our people and fatherland. I wish you all the best for the future, Heil Hitler." It didn't make sense. Bloch was a war hero, the kind of man the Nazis mythologized. Sure, he was part Jewish, but he'd still die fighting when the Russians arrived in Berlin in 1945. For him, the fatherland was everything, and he was tossed aside like a poisoned apple. It's not certain how many full Jewish people or partial Jews there were in the German military, but according to the historian Brian Mark Rigg, it was many. Rigg claimed the Wehrmacht was home to about 60,000 half-Jews and 90,000 quarter Jews, including some generals, admirals, and one man who climbed as high as field marshal. At least 20 received a variation of the Nazis' highest military award, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Some had been drafted, others volunteered, following in the footsteps of their fathers who had fought in the First Great War. But for some, it was a matter of survival. The darkest irony was that, as one person said, the Wehrmacht was the safest place for a Jew in Hitler's Germany. The exact number has been debated, but there is no doubt at all that tens of thousands of Jews fought under Adolf Hitler. Many, it seems, did not think the Nuremberg laws even applied to them. Anti-Semitism was for the other Jews, the Ostjuden, people according to Tablet magazine who were viewed as uneducated and superstitious by the other Jews. People forget that many German Jews were fiercely patriotic. They were people of high education, cultured Germans, men and women whose roots were firmly embedded in German soil for hundreds of years. But for some, including Himmler, no man who shared his blood with a Jew had a right to serve in the ranks of the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, or the Luftwaffe. In 1940, the message came down from the top. The Jews must go, either full ones or mixed blood. Some officers refused. Their men were a brotherhood. They weren't going to send someone home because their grandfather had married a Jewish woman. They told their Mischling soldiers to lie low. Other officers sent letters back to the Nazi hierarchy in Germany asking how a man with an iron cross could suddenly become the enemy. Not all were so supportive. One officer was furious a Jew had hidden in his ranks. He called for the men, took out his pistol, and shot him in the head. A part Jewish Waffen-SS officer admitted if they'd have found out that he was part Jew, they'd have hung him from the nearest tree. His patriotic family had German ancestors that went back 400 years. But for the Nazis, it didn't matter. There are stories of Jewish soldiers creating or paying for forged papers that hid their real ethnicity. They lived in constant fear, telling lies about childhood infections if they had to take off their clothes and their circumcised penis was exposed. But many more didn't even consider themselves Jewish. They had brought up Gentile children. They neither followed Jewish customs nor observed Jewish religious practices. For some, finding out they had part Jewish blood was as much a shock to them as the troops they were fighting with. They hadn't even known. A man named Hans Gunzel survived the war, but 57 of his Jewish relatives didn't. He was half Jewish, and so were many of his relatives. After the war, he wrote, "The sad thing about all of their deaths is that most had converted to Christianity and didn't consider themselves Jews. And while others were haunted and conflicted by the oppression and violence their Jewish relatives were facing in the ghettos or camps, some applied for a dispensation. It was the only way to get around the order. And it had to come from Hitler. If he deemed it necessary, he could sign the same kind of document he'd signed for Maurice." In what was a profound hypocrisy, thousands of Mischlinge considered too valuable to lose remained in the military because of the stroke of the Führer's pen. If they had won combat medals or gained battlefield promotions, there was a good chance Hitler would give them the exemption. It was simple bureaucratic chicanery, but a startling contradiction considering what was still happening to the Jews in the concentration and death camps. Still, it was completely legal. Article 7 of the Nuremberg Laws clearly stated that Hitler could remove the alleged stain of Jewishness from someone's name if he chose to make them part Aryan. As Jewish children were torn from their mothers and Jews were herded into the gas chamber, Hitler essentially Aryanized others. He was cheating his own system. As the Nazi war machine expanded, the contradictions were exposed, and this terrifying bureaucracy of Nazi annihilation orders arrived right at the doorstep of a man Hitler had once treated like a saint, Dr. Bloch. Some of Hitler's last words to him were a promise that threatened to dismantle Hitler's integrity. After the Nazis marched on Austria in March 1938 and annexed the country, much of the Austrian population greeted the soldiers in the streets waving swastika flags. Britain and France looked on as Austrians against German rule contemplated the arrival of hell. And no one feared the future quite as much as the Jews, as many as 200,000 of them. Thousands were arrested overnight. Jewish children were told school university was over. Jewish homes were plundered as men and women were dragged through the streets. Professionals were made to clean toilets. Synagogues were razed. Shops were graffitied or destroyed. It was almost impossible to hide. Every Jew now forced to sew on their clothes the dreaded yellow badge. All within this chaos, among the tears and blood, was Hitler's favorite doctor, Mr. Bloch. As the Gestapo terrorized his friends and family, he wondered when it was his turn to feel the full force of Nazi ideological fury. He waited in fear for the worst to happen, knowing the orders for the devastation had come from a boy he had once treated for colds and tonsillitis. For Bloch, Hitler had been such a lovely boy. How was it possible that he could change like that? The Adolf Hitler that he'd known all those years ago was curious and mild-mannered, always going for walks in the mountains, always reading books. He was fascinated by stories about Native Americans. Yet this curious child now seemed to hate anyone who wasn't Aryan. Bloch spent nights awake in bed asking himself about this transformation. For him, it was a matter of life and death. He certainly couldn't carry on working. His practice closed its doors about 6 months after the Nazis arrived. He was one of the lucky ones, though. He had enough money to send his children away, both of them immigrating abroad. But he was already 66. Did he really need to run? He wondered, should he contact Hitler himself? Would that help? Or get him transported? Bloch kept telling himself Hitler's final words to him after Clara died. "I shall be grateful to you forever." Forever. That one word was imprinted on his mind. He wondered, would Hitler recall that promise? And then came the knock on the door. Outside stood an agent of the Gestapo. The man said, "I am informed that you have some souvenirs of the Führer. I should like to see them." The officer didn't have to say anything else. Bloch understood. When Hitler had been living in hostels in Vienna among poor, bedraggled men, he had written Bloch postcards. One of them said, "I became dissatisfied with myself for the first time in my life." It was the first time that Bloch noticed a darkness taking over the young man's mind. Hitler had grown bitter. He had hated the government. He was lost and angry. But as yet, he didn't hate Jews, not all of them. Bloch was one of the few people in the world Hitler admired, and he was a Jew and proud of it. And then came another short missive, one of the postcards Hitler painted and sold on the streets. It featured a hooded capuchin monkey hoisting a glass of bubbling champagne. At the bottom, Hitler had written, "The Hitler family sends you best wishes for a happy new year. In everlasting thankfulness, Adolf Hitler." Everlasting. Another life or death word for Bloch. Hitler had shown kindness to a Jew. Such an artifact was dangerous, evidence of a contradiction Hitler could not afford to be exposed. So Bloch knew what the Gestapo man at the door wanted. He told him to wait and soon returned with the goods. The man took them and wrote on a piece of paper, "Certificate for the safekeeping of 2 postcards, one of them painted by the hand of Adolf Hitler, confiscated in the house of Dr. Eduard Bloch." Bloch headed straight to the small hotel in Gesellenhausstrasse where the Gestapo HQ had been set up and asked why the postcards had been taken from him. He knew the answer, but he wanted to hear it from a Nazi. The officer was surprisingly very polite and asked about Bloch's ethnicity. Bloch replied, "I am 100% Jew." The officer looked him in the eye and told him the postcards are for safekeeping. And that was it. They had confiscated evidence of Nazi hypocrisy, but of course they wouldn't admit that. What Bloch didn't know was that the highly educated officer in front of him, Otto Rasch, would become one of the most cruel leaders of the SS. He would personally oversee the extermination of Polish intelligentista, and he would sign off on the murder of tens of thousands of Jews. When he took control of Einsatzgruppe C, he demanded that every man in his unit personally shoot Jews, so every one of them had blood on their hands. He was a maniac, and he had just had to speak ever so politely to a Jew. Why? Because Bloch had a guardian angel watching over him. An angel of death maybe, but one with arguably more power than anyone in mainland Europe. Something else Bloch didn't know at the time was what Hitler had said about him in 1937. Before the Nazis invaded Austria, Hitler had been at a conference and asked about the town of Linz. He had specifically asked if Dr. Bloch was still practicing there, and to the shock of everyone around him, he had said, "Dr. Bloch is a noble Jew. If all Jews were like him, there would be no Jewish question." Bloch later admitted when he had found out he had taken it as a compliment. It was strange, and in a way flattering, that Adolf Hitler could see good in at least one member of my race. But now his people were being rounded up, their lives destroyed. The world had gone crazy. He watched on when Hitler arrived in his town in the back of a Mercedes car flanked by motorcycles, the crowds cheering, Jews hiding in their houses. How long until they came for him? But then something happened that gave him hope. Jude was painted on the side of all Jewish houses and shops in bright yellow, and Bloch's practice, where he also lived, was no different. But he received a call from the Gestapo. He was allowed to remove the sign from his house. Then came another call. His landlord. The landlord told him he had gone to the Gestapo office to ask if Bloch should remain in his home. He'd been told, "We wouldn't dare touch that matter. It will be handled by Berlin." Unlike possibly every last Jew in Austria, no one even confiscated his passport, and no letter J was stamped on his ration card when the food started running low. Unlike every other Jew in the city, he ate well and dressed well as Hitler began to transform the town of his birth. He sent in huge teams of laborers to build parks and theaters, even a new bridge over the Danube. As the transformation happened and the Jews vanished by the day, Dr. Bloch was spared from harm. It was now clear to Bloch that Hitler had indeed remembered his old friend and his promise of eternal gratefulness. Still, he knew it wouldn't last. It seemed like every month there was a frightening new announcement or order. The Nazis wouldn't stop until all the Jews were transported or dead. The illusion that good behavior or past service guaranteed his survival was about to be shattered by another figure from Hitler's past. Hero of World War I, Ernst Hess, was a practicing Protestant, but both his parents were Jewish, so that made him a Jew. Not just any Jew, but a remarkable soldier who had once commanded the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 that fought at Ypres and the Somme. But that was not the reason why everyone in Germany had heard of that particular regiment. The reason was one of its soldiers. His name was Adolf Hitler. Young Hitler had served diligently in the war, and he'd done so under Hess, a man that he respected. Most Jews who'd fought for their country in the First War were under the impression that when the persecution came, their service would shield them from harm. But even Hess, Hitler's old boss, wasn't untouchable. In 1935, he was a judge when the Nuremberg laws came into effect. Despite his Christian heritage and connection to the Führer, he was forced to step down. But surely he'd been better off than most other Jews? It seemed that way for a while. Heinrich Himmler himself signed off a letter explicitly stating that Hess should be protected, neither deported nor persecuted, as per the Führer's wishes. The letter clearly stated that Hess was not to be inopportuned in any way whatsoever. This man, once decorated with an Iron Cross, was safe for now. As hell broke out all around him, his relatives and friends were sent to the camps. He and his Gentile wife carried on as normal. Well, as much as was possible in those circumstances. Still, he didn't feel safe, so he wrote a letter to Hitler asking for himself and his daughter to be shown lenience. He admitted his Jewishness, but reminded Hitler of his Christian upbringing and patriotism. For us, he wrote, it is a kind of spiritual death to now be branded as Jews and exposed to general contempt. Hitler didn't quite sign off on the petition, but he did grant Hess some concessions. He was allowed to keep his army pension and carry a passport that lacked the large red J stamp used to identify Jewish passport holders. He was safe, but in the background, Heinrich Himmler was becoming very frustrated with Hitler's sentimental protections. For Himmler, there was only one solution, the final solution. Not one with Jewish blood, not even war heroes should be exempt. So as Hess planned his future, the long arms of the final solution started grasping into every crevice and basement. The bureaucratic protections once awarded to Jews like him began to crack and wither under the weight of industrialized slaughter. Dr. Bloch knew that his protection was by no means unconditional. He told himself the only guarantee of getting through this war with his life intact was by moving far away from Austria. His children were now in New York City, they were safe. Maybe he could join them. With his practice long closed and his valuables packed away and ready, he was prepared to go. The fact that he wasn't in a camp or lying in a ditch with a bullet in his back was already remarkable. But would he be able to leave Austria with his life savings? Was that expecting too much? Landing in a foreign country with hardly a penny to his name wasn't ideal. But Bloch knew the Nazis had done everything in their power to stop Jews from taking money out of the Reich. At the start of the 1930s, the German government introduced the Reich Flight Tax. It aimed to stop wealthy Germans from moving their fortunes abroad during the economic chaos of the Depression. The tax seized 25% of a person's assets if they possessed more than 200,000 Reichsmarks or earned over 20,000 Reichsmarks a year. This affected everyone, not just Jews. But once the Nazis took power and Jewish families began fleeing persecution, the policy evolved into outright confiscation. Jewish wealth was systematically expropriated through taxes, forced sales, blocked accounts, and state seizure. Not so much taxation as organized piracy. For that reason, Bloch assumed that he would never be permitted to leave with his life savings intact. The question was, would he receive special treatment? Again, he returned to the Gestapo office in Linz. He was told that he was a lucky man. A special dispensation from high up would allow him to take 16 Reichsmarks out of the country. That was 6 more than the 10 normally permitted to fleeing Jews. 16 marks, enough for a few hot meals and a new suit. Bloch never wrote it in his memoirs, but later historians reported that he was also allowed to sell his home at full market value. Countless other Austrian Jews were stripped of their property for next to nothing. How he got the money across isn't certain, but it seems that Hitler had helped him again. And before he left, he was told that he'd be safe. The Nazis gave him a letter to state that he was a man worthy of recommendation in accordance with his good character, medical knowledge, and readiness to help the sick. The letter ended that he had won the appreciation and esteem of his fellow men. An official handed him the letter as a silence filled the room. The official waited. "Ah, yes, thank you," said Bloch, remembering that he should appear grateful. The officer informed him that perhaps the right thing to do now would be to write a letter of appreciation for the person who had been so kind to him. And so, on that November morning, fog covering the houses outside, he took his pen and started writing. "Your Excellency, before passing the border, I want to express my thanks for the protection which I have received." He explained that he'd now be starting again in poverty in a new country, but he was thankful for the kindness that had been shown to him. His life's work gone, 16 marks in his pocket, but at least he was alive. Early one morning, suitcase in hand, he closed the door behind him and took one last look back at his old life. He'd be fine, he knew it. It was quite obvious now that Adolf Hitler would not allow harm to come to him. But as he walked down the street on the way to the station, the faces of millions of forlorn men, women, and children filled his mind. The sorrows that these people had to face. It was unthinkable. Bloch was safe, but behind the scenes, the Nazis were drawing up secret lists. The kindness was over. It was time to start reining in the ones who had gotten lucky. About 100,000 Jews had served in Germany during World War I. When the persecution started after the Nazis came to power, they thought they'd be safe. The veterans refused to hide their heads in shame. If they were hassled in the street or their stores defaced, ordinary Germans were seen defending them. They would scream at the police or SS guards, reminding them these men had once served their country. It should be remembered that only around 44% of the Germans voted for the Nazis in 1933, but once Hitler took power and did what he had promised, he revived the economy, reduced unemployment, and restored a sense of national pride. So naturally, support for the regime grew. Still, many Germans weren't on board with the Nazis' most extreme anti-Semitic policies. Some even dared to oppose the ideas, and tens of thousands were executed. Many others very quietly disliked what was happening, but looked the other way as their own lives became more stable. Fear, propaganda, conformity, and self-interest all played their part. But for many, imprisoning World War I veterans just seemed wrong. After all, the Nazis glorified war. They painted their veterans in the colors of saints. And so it was an outstanding contradiction to now persecute these men and their families. Like Ernst Hess, many were given support from the officers of the German army. This forced the Nazi hierarchy into a corner, and for the most part the veterans were spared transportation to the labor and death camps. But not for long. It would turn out that these people were wrong to think the Nazis could be trusted. As Himmler forced Hitler's hand, the laws that had been developed to protect veterans peeled away like a snake shedding its skin. In 1941, the Nazis opened the Theresienstadt ghetto, a way station of sorts. It was here that the Jews would labor and wait for transportation to the extermination camps. Conditions were terrible. Tens of thousands would die of exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition before they could be deported. Then in 1942, on the orders of Reinhard Heydrich, it was agreed that Theresienstadt would now house a new kind of prisoner, Jewish veterans of World War I. Again, the Nazis had moved the goalposts. Along with the soldiers would be Jews of high standing, men whose sudden disappearance would create suspicion abroad. After all, the final solution was a deeply held secret within the Nazi hierarchy. When word got out about Theresienstadt, the Nazis claimed it wasn't a hell on earth, not even like it. They said that it was a spa town, like a retirement village for the Jews who'd earned the privilege of being sent there. In 1941, when Hess appeared at the Aryanization office in Munich and submitted his letter of protection, the officer ripped it out of his hands. The officer, Franz Richard Mugler, informed him that his protection had been revoked and now he was a Jew like any other Jew. He was arrested and sent to work as a common laborer at the Milbertshofen camp. He was later sent to a construction firm for labor and forced to sleep in what the Nazis called a Jew house. His only protection now was that he avoided the worst of the concentration camps due to his privileged, miscegenated marriage. From riches to poverty, his wife Marguerite and her daughter Ursula did whatever they could to find money to eat. Hess's whole family believed that they were protected by the force field of his military history. But it wasn't to be. His sister Bertha was gassed at Auschwitz. Hess now feared that he and everyone else would end up the same way. For many other Jewish people, those who'd been spared, the protections kept on peeling away. It became much worse after the July 20th plot of 1944, when a group of high-level officers came close to assassinating Hitler. Paranoia swept through the ranks, and the half-Jews who had managed to stay in the Wehrmacht were expelled and arrested by the Gestapo. In strategic terms, this was utter stupidity. Tens of thousands of fighting men were sent back to Germany when their Jewishness was exposed. Most went to the forced labor camps of the organization Tod, where some met their fathers, the Aryan husbands of their Jewish mothers. The camp wasn't as harsh as the others, and most survived, but these men were wasted in a war the Germans had been losing. It was the same when it came to armaments production. The Germans again proved themselves to be reckless when they chose ideology over winning a war. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had ordered all Jews engaged in armament production to be removed in 1942. It was a decision that was criticized by General Kurt Ludwig von Gienath for reducing the, quote, military potential of the Reich. Hitler had changed. From protecting certain people who had served Germany, he became cynical. Writing about Jews attempting to escape transportation by claiming not to be Jewish, he declared, if worst came to worst, a splash of baptismal water could always save the business and the Jew at the same time. Never fear, he added, the ability to camouflage ancestry by changing religions will completely disappear. The crackdown was now in full swing. Hitler's personal whims had finally been overridden by the unstoppable momentum of the death machine he'd created. It turns out that Honorary Aryan status was nothing more than a stay of execution. Ernst Hess survived the war, and though he never returned to serving as a judge, he rebuilt his life in post-war Germany. In 1946, he started a new career on the railways. From 1949 to 1955, he served as president of the General Federal Railways Authority in Frankfurt am Main. By 1970, a commemorative plaque had been dedicated to him in Frankfurt, a remarkable end for a man once stripped of his rights. By 1983, the suffering he'd carried all his life evaporated as he passed away at age 93. But his words lived on. When after the war someone had asked him about Hitler and what it was like to serve with him, he replied, "What Hitler? He was in our unit? We never even noticed him." To think, a man who caused so much pain and suffering was a nobody, a shadow of insignificance, but a dangerous one nonetheless. And if there was one man who understood how evil can grow from insignificance, it was Eduard Bloch. He had gotten out of Germany in one piece and headed to Lisbon, Portugal. He was there waiting to board a ship that would take him to New York City when a British soldier asked to see his papers. The soldier read the name and smiled. "You were Hitler's physician, weren't you?" Bloch was famous, not a distinction he was proud of. He once provided comfort to a man who had exterminated millions of people on the basis of pieces of paper that defined a person's race. He sailed across the stormy Atlantic and landed in the New World, a world completely untouched by the ravages of war. There, he blended in and got on with life living among the Jewish community in the Bronx, but not for long. He died in 1945 from stomach cancer. The only Jew that didn't find himself running was Hitler's former right-hand man, Emil Maurice. His eighth Jewishness would never completely die, but it was a fraction the Nazis could live with. Hitler fired him from his position of chauffeur in 1927 when Maurice admitted to having an affair with Hitler's young niece Geli Raubel. Still, he remained in the SS as a constant reminder to Himmler that a man whose blood was contaminated had founded the organization he was so proud of. The Americans deemed him a Class II Nazi offender, and Maurice only spent 4 years in prison. After that, he became a humble watchmaker and died in 1972, having once believed he and his colleagues could rule over Europe as the master race. He died aware of an unmistakable irony. At the heart of the world he and his fellow Nazis tried to create, a society obsessed with racial purity, built upon an ideology so incredibly stubborn it constantly contradicted itself, even Hitler and Himmler must at some level have understood that there was no such thing as pure blood, and that ancestry alone could never determine a person's character or worth. That premise was false from the beginning, yet millions of people, Jews, Slavs, Roma, Asians, and others, suffered and died because of it. Hitler may have made exceptions for a few individuals, but that didn't make life in Nazi Germany any less brutal for everyone else. To see what daily survival actually looked like for ordinary German families under the regime, watch What Living Under Hitler Was Really Like, or click on this video.